We departed Darjeeling in the spring of 1897 for a survey of India reconnaissance into the high valleys north of Sikkim, and within days the porters would not walk a particular ridge because of a thing they called the Yeti. I had gone to fix trig points with theodolite and plane table, not to answer mountain tales, yet the mountain's warnings tightened like a cord around our party. We set out under a sky bruised thin with Himalayan light, a small late Victorian detachment in the manner of official business. 2 English assistants, Mr. Pembroke and Mr. Allen, a Tibetan Lama who served as interpreter, and 30 local porters and Sherpa guides. Our beasts were yaks and mules, their hair flecked with spring melt. They bore the brass theodolite crated in oiled canvas, a stout plane table with its alidade, an aneroid barometer for altitude, a chronometer for timekeeping, and a dry plate camera whose glass plates I kept wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp. We had tinned meat, hard biscuits, tea enough to steady hands for many weeks, and a small stock of paraffin for the lantern by which Pembroke and I would sketch our plans at night. The work was precise and mundane in its demands. Set the theodolite upon a cairn, level and read the graduated circle. Record bearings for triangulation with the plane table. We would sketch the ridgelines and the sweep of moraines as the Lama called out local names. I had spent early mornings polishing the instrument's lenses, checking the chronometer against the railway time I had left in Darjeeling, and noting barometric falls that foretold weather. The men grew used to the ritual of measurement and meal, the clink of brass, the rasp of woolen blankets, the little triumphs of a site fixed and a map extended. It was the porters, steady men from villages below the snows, who first spoke in sober tones of the ridge we were to cross. They would not walk it, they said, not at dawn nor at dusk, for a thing lived upon its spine. Their refusals came with gestures rather than argument, fingers drawn across throats, eyes averted, the Lama translating names and nodding with a gravity that gave the tale the weight of local history. I took their caution for superstition. At first, mountains breed many fancies in men unaccustomed to their silences. Yet even superstition in such places has its reasons. Within 2 days of our leaving the lower pastures, we found evidence that made the men silent. On a wind-scoured bench of moraine, we discovered large impressions in the new snow, not the regular cleft of a mule's hoof, nor the spreading of a yak. These were single tracks, elongated, set wide apart as if a broad creature had trodden with deliberate stride. Around them, the snow had a slight crust, flecked with a darker color, hair that clung to the ridged surface of a rock, coarse and matted. The Lama examined it with hands that trembled not from cold, but from respect. He pronounced the name and folded his palms. The porters would not proceed. Night in those altitudes thins the world to essentials: breath, the ticking of the chronometer in its case, the hiss of tea poured over leaves, and the distant cracking of ice as a glacier adjusted itself. Pembroke and I spoke in low voices, measuring the tracks against our known fauna, but the evidence would not be reconciled to ibex or leopard. The dry plate camera took its first exposures under lantern light. I set glass plates and aimed the lens at the ridgeline where the tracks ended, hoping to record that which sight and memory might otherwise misplace. The plates were costly and few, but necessary to any proper account. Weather turned the following day. A barometer fall, Pembroke noted aloud, and the light vanished to a wash of grey. We huddled beneath a windbreak of sacks, the Lama telling us of a creature seen by his uncle in the time of the 6th Dalai Lama. Details offered without the flourish of fable, as one might speak of a dangerous pass. The porters kept to the lower hollows. At dusk, one of the Sherpa guides refused his ration of tinned meat and sat with a prayer flag wrapped round his shoulders, repeating a mantra under his breath. Small human courtesies took on a new gravity: the checking of knots, the retying of girths, the inspection of pack saddles. I kept a journal, remarking bearings and the position of our camp by chronometer, noting the track's dimensions and the hair's texture as if these were ordinary field notes. Yet even the measured record could not dispel the sense of being watched. Sound carried strangely on those ridges, a knocking that might be falling stone, a long, low cry that might be wind in a hollow. Each turned our heads and pulled at the light of reason. We would rise in the grey and approach the ridge to take a bearing each time. The men balked, forming a knot of figures against the slope, as if their combined presence might lessen whatever lay above. We did not retreat. The tasks of triangulation and mapping were as binding as any oath, and maps were the language by which empire and knowledge alike advanced. Still, I ordered the men to hold the line of descent and prepared to set the theodolite on the nearest stable cairn. Pembroke tightened the tripod screws with fingers numb from cold, but steady from habit. The Lama blessed the instrument and murmured a hope for safe passage. As we made ready, a sound like a great stone shifted somewhere above us, and the assembled party fell quiet as a field of grain at first gust. The ridge waited, and with it a question I had not wished to answer. We advanced toward it at first light, each man with his burden and his belief, the maps unopened between us and the snow. We listened until the murmur of men and the scrape of leather ceased beneath the wind. Nawang drew his prayer flags close and spat. The sound was small against the groan of the seracs, but it carried between us like an acknowledgement. Captain Hargreaves pulled the collar of his greatcoat higher, his breath a thin white that fogged and vanished. We had with us theodolite and chain, an aneroid barometer for altitudes, a box camera with several spare dry plates, 2 service rifles, a coil of manila rope, and the customary cache of tea, biscuits, and pemmican. Our tents were canvas, sewn thick and salted at the seams against wind. The men had galoshes lashed to their packs and goggles wrapped in oilcloth. We advanced, taking the caution of surveyors. Every 3 paces, Hargreaves marked the bearing on the compass, and I struck the probe into snow to test for hidden crevasses. The guides moved ahead with a silence I had not expected. Their boots made less sound than the wind across the ridge. Where the trail fell away, we found the first signs that the guides had mentioned. Bits of thatch and wooden slat from a shepherd's shieling scattered at odd angles, one post splintered clear through. A single flake of wool, darkened with the grease of yak, clung to a jagged nail. Beyond the ruined hut, the snow gave clear evidence of recent passage. The prints lay in a straight line, as if the maker did not falter nor stagger. I measured one with the surveyor's tape, 14 inches from heel to the forwardmost impression, an arched instep and the telltale splay of toes. The depth was inconsistent, deeper where the slope fell away, as though the weight had been borne forward with intent. The stride between prints was nearer 5 feet. Hargreaves set the theodolite upon its tripod, and we took bearings. The barometer read roughly 14,200 feet. an elevation at which few living creatures besides man and yak could be common. I scraped the snow aside with my glove and found a hair caught upon a stone where the track had brushed. It was coarse, longer than a man's, a rusted brown with darker tips. We wrapped it in a scrap of waxed paper and placed it in my pocketbook. For the camera dry plates, we hastily arranged a frame to show scale and took 3 exposures. The light was poor, a low blue afternoon that left exposures long. The men held the white sheet while I tramped the poses, hands numb with cold, the shutter clattering like a small, frightened bird. That evening, we made a lean camp beneath a snow ridge. The men ate quickly, mending harnesses by the light of the kerosene lamp, while the guides sat apart, their figures dark against the pale drift. Nawang would not sleep. He kept watch with a stick of pine that he would strike against rock from time to time, as if to ward the approach of anything that might be listening. I tended the plates in the dark tent, and by the time the second lamp sputtered its last, the men had drifted off into uneasy slumber, and the wind had become a hard thing that consumed sound. At 2 a.m, we were awake to a sound that was not wind. It began like the rubbing of a great leather hide against the glacier, low, labouring, and rose into a long, resonant cry that set the tent fabric trembling. The men stirred as one. Hargreaves whispered for the rifles, but Nawang would not allow firing. He pressed his palm to the canvas and murmured a prayer, eyes shut. The noise came closer, and then stopped as abruptly as if a hand had been laid on its throat. There followed a succession of knocks, 3 at a post beyond our small fire, each solid and deliberate. At dawn, we found new tracks. They circled the camp, pausing at the tethered yak where one animal had been bitten at the flank but not taken. The rope tether had been frayed, and there were tufts of hair caught where the rope had been gnawed. There were also impressions in the snow of hands, or hand-like depressions, laid flat and wide, as if to examine the ground. The largest of these depressions was broader than my open palm by some measure. Hargreaves swore softly and took another reading with the barometer, as if to convince himself of reality. We debated then whether to follow. The guides said the signs led toward the glacier, and higher passes their faces, set in the morning light, showed worry. They would not go alone. I made the choice by the ledger of duty and curiosity that had governed my life in the field. We followed at first at a steady survey pace, marking points and taking bearings. Then the terrain narrowed and the air grew thin, and the line of prints turned upward toward a serac-scarred chute that led to the bergschrund. Halfway up the chute, a shadow moved at the lip of a meltout, and for the first time I saw the creature. It did not come close. It stood there, larger than any man yet, of a posture uncannily bipedal long arms, shoulders massive, and covered in the same rusted hair we had gathered at the stone. It regarded us. Our rifles rose, but no one could speak. The figure gave a single sound, neither bark nor call, but something between, and turned, not in haste, but with the deliberateness of a thing at home upon those heights, and descended by an eye of rock where no trail had seemed practicable. We did not pursue. Hargreaves would later insist our restraint was a matter of prudence. The guides said it was the creature's will. We took more photographs, measured more prints, and left a mark upon the map with the ink stain of that day's bearing. When we returned to the low country, the men spoke less of the altitude and more of that sound in the night and of the hair in my packet. Photographs went into my field notes, and the pages smell yet of kerosene and sweat. We carried on with the survey, and yet the impression of that silhouette hung between us. The men avoided the subject or offered a dry laugh. Nawang began to fast at times, speaking to the mountain blessings as if to appease something higher than our instruments. The note in my journal for June 1897 ends with the entry of the new line on the map and the record of our measured prints. It does not answer why the creature had chosen our path, nor whether it would be found again. We left a cairn upon the ridge as a sign that men had been there. The wind has a habit of erasing such things. We descended to plan a return with further instruments, and with that intention the story remained unresolved, heavy as the barometer reading I had set aside in the tent, a small, stubborn truth at the edge of known country. We found the first clear evidence on a moraine, a single line of depressions in packed snow, at least 1.5 feet in length, and spaced unlike any human stride, which I photographed on a glass plate and measured with a ruler. The marks lay across the lip of the ridge, as if whatever made them had walked the crest and paused to look down the valley. The glass plate lay cold in my hand when I replaced it in its holder. The image, once developed, would show the shadowed rims and the granular texture of the snow. But at that moment, there was only wind and the metallic clack of the camera tripod as I packed it away. We were on the northward face of the ridge, the sun already low and turning the ice a hard, blanched blue. Nawang, our headman, stooped with his tobacco-stained fingers and ran them along the edge of the nearest depression. His face was unreadable beneath the woolen cap. The porters stood a pace back, their breath rising in short clouds. The canvas of their loads creaked as if protesting the cold. I had with me the aneroid barometer I always carried upon my breast. It hung on its cord, an instrument of brass and small glass, and had been my companion through many a survey. It trembled now. The needle had dropped with such suddenness that it read as though a storm had just borne upon the slope. Close at hand, a strip of canvas from a porter's pack had been torn. The fibres were frayed, the weave strained as if rucked about something blunt. I picked it up with gloved fingers. Brown earth and a dark smudge of something matted into the threads. Old blood, I thought, until Nawang pointed to the thorny bush beyond, where tufts of coarse, matted hairs clung among the twigs like clinging thoughts. They were not the fine, glossy hair of our porters, nor the shag of the ponies. They were long, dark, and kinked in a manner I could not match to any animal of the high passes that I knew. We measured the depressions twice. With ruler and eye, we recorded length, depth, and the strange spacing that had first arrested me. Intervals longer and more irregular than a man's walk, yet not the bounding gait of a goat or snow leopard. I made notes in my field book, entries in ink that trembled with the cold, and later I set a second glass plate to take another photograph from a different angle. The camera required time, 3 minutes for the exposure. The tripod feet sunk into the snow like deliberate posts. During that small eternity, we listened. Sound was swallowed there. We had grown used to the moan of wind over hard ice and the distant slap of cornices, but when the needle of the aneroid fell, it was as if the air itself had been sucked away. The porters' talk fell to a hush. Even their footprints seemed to stop. A bell from one of the pack-yaks tinkled without cause and then ceased. I remember the smell, dry, metallic, the high air of rock and old blood, and the pressing quiet that followed the barometer's reading, as though the mountain were holding its breath with us. I signaled to Khan, who kept the instruments. He moved to set the theodolite upon its tripod, his fingers steady though his jaw was tight. We were obliged to record what we found. The science of the survey demanded proof. Our instruments, compass, sextant, chain, boiling flask, for taking an altitudinal reading, were the liturgy of our work. Yet there was the knowledge that paper and brass could not wholly account for the sensation that passed among us then, a thing without form that ventured at the corners of sight. We followed the line, lowering ourselves down a narrow snow shelf, taking care with each step. The depressions bent around a small glacier tongue and vanished where the slope steepened and the wind had scoured the snow bare. At that point, we found a place where the canvas had been further torn and several more tufts of hair had caught upon a stone. One of the younger porters, whose name I do not record for posterity, but who had served 3 years with us, stared long at those hairs and swallowed audibly. He told Nawang in his native tongue that he had seen, in childhood, paintings of mountain saints with long hair and large hands, but his voice betrayed him the superstition, and the late hour braided and made the porters suddenly wary. We camped that night on the lee of the moraine, pitching the heavy canvas tents and heaping stones to anchor them. I kept the glass plate in my breast then, close to my chest to keep it warm and to prevent the collodion from flaking. The men smoked and spoke in low voices of home and would not look up at the ridge. The aneroid rested upon the rucksack beside my sleeping roll. Every time the wind shifted, I would glance at it to find the needle unchanged, then jolt, as if the slope itself were moved by some living thing. We resolved to follow the trail at first light and laid our plans by dim lantern. The theodolite to take bearings at the moraine, 2 men to advance with long poles to probe the snow, the others to remain with the camp and keep watch. Yet, as I wrote those orders, the mountain top seemed to press upon my hand. The notes in my field book were blotted with a little snow and, perhaps, with the tremor of apprehension. We had found a record on the earth that was not of ours, and the instruments had registered a change as sudden and inexplicable as a living thing's breath. Dawn would come, and with it a choice: to pursue what had made those depressions, or to retreat with the proofs we had already secured. I slept fitfully, conscious of the hair in my palm and of the barometer's needle, which had not returned to its proper station. We stood upon a narrow ridge as dusk fell. The world behind us folded into shadow, and the last of the sun thrown in a bruise of crimson along the eastern wall. A wind came up from the valley that tasted of powder and cold stone. My fingers, cramped against the brass of the theodolite case, felt the premonitory tremor of altitude. The party had been engaged, as we had been most days, in the simple and relentless business of measurement. Triangulation stations, barometric checking with my aneroid, the slow, patient arithmetic of a topographical map. Our mules grazed at the scant tussocks. The porters squatted with pipes lit, their breath like ghosts against the darkening air. Then, abrupt as the change from day to night, movement crossed the ridge. At first, I thought it a man fallen from his footing. Then the thing rose, and I saw, with a dislocation of ordinary perception, that it was taller than any man present, and not a man. It bent and moved with long, rolling strides the consumed ground faster than one would expect upon such precarious rock. Its shoulders rolled in a way like a great quadruped's when it chose to walk erect, an economy of motion that suspected no haste and yet was swift beyond the bounds of ordinary animal gait. Long, pale hair hung from it, not the dark pelage of the ibex or the shaggy coat of the Himalayan bear, but a pallor that caught the light and threw it back in streaks, like the washed fibers of old rope. It made no attempt to hide, and yet there was a deliberation to its inspection of us. From its throat came low, resonant calls, not cries, but tones like distant bells muffled by snow. And when those sounds reached the mules, the beasts shied as if faced with thunder. Leather and tin clattered, a few porters scrambled, knocking small articles from packs. Nawang cursed softly, and then, without ceremony, began to gather the trailing ropes. Order kept me steadier than surprise. I barked for the theodolite to be packed with deliberate hands. The instrument was the heart of our work, heavy and precise, its joints oiled for the cold. Caldwell, who had the camera, fumbled the dark slide with a steadier hand than I had expected in his youth and snapped a hurried exposure. Our camera was the familiar, cumbersome instrument of the age, a box with bellows, glass dry plates stacked like cards in a tin, a tripod that had served us across 2 ranges and a dozen bad weather nights. Caldwell had little time for composition. His lens turned, recorded what light there was, and then the plate was forced back into its holder, smeared with the breath of our hurry. The creature approached the length of rope we had cast across the crest as a test line for the party's passage. It touched this rope with a hand that was too large to be a man's, fingers thick and curiously long, and the hemp cord bowed under the weight and pressure. Its fingers felt like packed wool, and the hair that lay over them moved in a wind of their own. The thing made a noise, not a shout, but a short, assessing sound. And then, to my astonishment, it tested the rope as a rope, examining it as a man might test the strength of a bridge. Then, with an ease that belied its size, it folded into a couloir and descended with a swiftness I would not have credited for a biped on such loose shale. We were shaken, but otherwise unscathed. No blows were struck, no one was taken. Yet the impression it left upon us was of something not surprised by our presence and not interested in provocation. Its retreat was neither panicked nor stealthy, it was economical, and it disappeared as quickly as it had materialized, down into the throat of the mountain where only avalanches and the mouths of seracs make permanent noise. We worked then by lantern light to make an inventory of what had occurred. The rope bore fibers frayed and starched by the touch of large, rough hands. The loose snow in the couloir showed prints that were too long for the usual ungulates and suggestively plantigrade. Caldwell, pale but shaking, tucked the exposed plate into a leather pouch and swore he had captured some trace, though whether it would be recognizable when developed was a different matter. The meat ration had been chewed at by something else. Small scraps were missing from a pack where we had thought to store them. Nawang would say later, in words translated to me by Karma, that the place had the feel of a man's grave left open. We made camp in haste, setting the theodolite under its canvas with all the care of an instrument mortally important to reputation and survey. The men would not be persuaded to continue along the same line. They sat huddled, their trade glass eyes on the couloir where the thing had gone. I kept my notebook and, at Caldwell's insistence, recorded the times and the barometer reading taken just before the sighting. Altitude 4,912 feet by the aneroid, temperature below freezing, wind from the northwest. These were the measured bones of a night that had produced an unmeasured thing. We did not sleep well. Every sudden sound, every fall of ice set bodies upright. At dawn, we meant to examine the couloir and the prints in more detail, to attempt a proper series of plates with longer exposures in the weak morning light, and to take further triangulation bearings from the ridge. The porters muttered of omens, Caldwell muttered of composition. I, who had always trusted measures more than stories, felt the peculiarity of being without an explanation. There was work to be done, and so there was an imperative beyond the shaking of nerves. We would follow the line of the couloir at first light, though the men would go no further than the base. We would record any trace with pencil and instrument, and we would carry the exposed plate with us as evidence, or, if nothing else, as a record of our nerves. The sighting had altered nothing on the map, but it had altered the temper of the party. We were, in the quiet hours before dawn, surveyors who had encountered a presence that the ordinances of our charts acknowledged. Not. The ridge kept its secrets through the night, and the next day the mountain would either answer our questions or deny them further. We limped back to the tented camp with one injured porter and a handful of torn supplies, filed a formal report with the Survey of India, and deposited the glass plates and witness statements in the station records. None supplied a definitive specimen or clear likeness. The men spoke in hushed tones thereafter, and the valley kept its silence. Our account became one among many late Victorian reports of the Yeti, unanswered but respected, a shadow on the maps we had come to make. The night we returned was a bruise of cold. Frost feathered the guy ropes, and the canvas creaked with the slow settling of ice. I remember the small domestic things first. The metallic smell of kerosene, the heap of canvas torn where a shoulder or a paw had brushed our outer shelter, a broken tent peg driven through woolen leggings. We set the injured porter on a straw pallet, undressed frost from his fingers, bound his wound with linen and spirit, and kept a watch with a single hurricane lamp guttering against the draught. The lamp threw the faces of the men in slanting pools, brown, wind-rutted, mute. They kept looking now at the dark below the ridge where the tracks had begun. Theodolite and plane table had survived. The tripod legs were scorched and splintered, but serviceable. We covered the glass plates with a piece of oiled paper and counted them by lamplight. The dry plates of our camera, the heavy brass and walnut camera we had carted up by mule from Darjeeling in June, were mostly scratched. The negative that might have shown the creature's outline was hopelessly blurred by a sudden lurch. I held it as one holds a relic, turning the glass until the lamp caught some faint impression of hair and shadow, and decided instead that the impression was of crumpled rock. A surveyor's faith is in measurement, and record our measures yielded nothing that could be reduced to a chain, a bearing, a dimension. We drafted the official report at dawn in the vestibule of the mess tent. My hand grew stiff from the ink and the cold. I used the plain diction the survey required: dates, altitudes, bearings from trigonometrical station 73, the condition of party and property, the statements of witnesses set down and signed. The porter's statement was in his own hand, shakily made on a scrap of paper between coughs. He wrote of a limb like a tree trunk, and of eyes that reflected like pool water. Another man's account was shorter. He had seen nothing but heard the timbre of heavy footfalls and the breaking of boughs. The accounts agreed on trail width and stride, they disagreed on posture and height. The plates were labelled, placed blind in a crate, and sent with the report to the survey office a copy of our field book. The triangulation notes and the index of tents went with them. There was a practical business in what followed. We lashed together a stretcher for the porter, shared out the sparse rations, salted meat, hard biscuits, a ration of brandy for the cold night, and re-rigged the pack animals. Navigation resumed as if the valley's hush might be mapped and thereby explained. We took bearings at first light, adjusted declination, fixed a point upon the opposite shoulder of the ridge, and named it in the field book. Naming was our way of mastering the unknown. Yet the place left a residue that did not bend to triangulation. The broken twig in a precise pattern, the impressions in snow that measured as if by a mammoth stride, the absence of any hair sample, though we searched until our hands bled with cold. Rumours moved with the porters as they always do, half superstitions, half practical caution. Some would not fetch water after dusk. Others recited a short prayer before stepping beyond the circle of tents. That human economy of fear kept the camp sober rather than hysterical. I remember a small incident that lingered longer than the larger sensation. The youngest assistant, who had always mocked the old country tales of ghosts and wights, brought me a scrap of fur the colour of peat that he had found under the ridge's overhang. We examined it by lamplight under the lens. It resolved to coarse hair of indeterminate species. We wrapped it in tissue, noted its find spot, and sealed it in the file next to the photographs. It was neither proof nor exculpation. When the official telegram acknowledged receipt from the survey office in Calcutta, I felt as if a line had been drawn between us and the world, thin and bureaucratic, yet real. The station clerk's stamp, the measured signature of a superintendent, these were the only certainties we could leave. Back in the cantonments, men debated whether our encounter ought to be sent to the Royal Geographical Society, whether the renderings of native myth should be enlisted or dismissed. We recorded everything we could, and that recording was itself a kind of defense against the vagueness that otherwise claimed the event. Years have ground the immediacy into reflection. Some of the men sought quieter stations. The injured porter never returned to the high passes. The negative plates, the statements, the drawing of tracks remain in a ledger in a government archive. I have seen the packet there, stamped, folded, the handwriting still a little tremulous at the edges. Our entry on the map was a small arrow with a note. Unidentified tracks observed. See report. The valley kept its silence. The Yeti, in whatever form it took that night, became a line in other men's journals as well. We added to the ledger of the unknown with all the fidelity we could muster. We returned to the civilization beneath the hills with boots worn through, with a loss of stores, and with a question that no measurement could yet answer.